So, our guest today is Paulo Ribeiro, and he is an avid gamer and amateur game designer. He's also a member of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen in Teaneck, New Jersey, and he holds a BA in Sociology from Montclair State University and is a graduate of the Humanist Institute. I can also add that he's been on faculty of the American Ethical Union's Lay Leadership Summer School, and has also been one of the people who's helped with the design of a number of publication things that the union has put out. So he's done a lot for the ethical movement, and has also done a lot to get us involved in the notion of how games might be engaged in ways, and technology in ways that will be helpful for us. So today he's going to be talking to us about changing the world through games. So Paulo?
Morning, everybody. So, a couple months ago, I was driving home, and they had just recently put in a new electronic sign that tracks your speed. You know, you've seen these things before that show you how fast you're going. And, you know, like a lot of these things, if you're going too fast, it was flashing red if you're going above the speed limit, right? And then, so I slowed down as I'm coming to a traffic light. And instead of just, most of the time it'll just have just in yellow, and it'll just stay constant what your actual speed is if you're below the speed limit by that point. But in this instance, it said, "Thank you." And so then a couple days later, I was coming home one night, and I'm driving by, and there's another one of these things that they had set up a little bit farther down the road. And that time, I immediately started to slow down, right? But it wasn't because in the past, because I was worried about people seeing that I was, going too fast, or because I was worried that a cop would pull me over or something like that. Why do you think I slowed down that time? I wanted to thank you, exactly. I wanted a little appreciation. Right? And so this is sort of the core idea of game design, is sort of giving that little bit of an experiential reward and trying to find ways that we can kind of nudge people in the direction of doing things that they know they probably should be doing, but may not be doing otherwise. So I've talked a lot in the past about how ethics in games come together. I've talked about the ethical issues that come up in game design, specifically in digital games. But I've also talked about how games can be used to teach children about various ethical issues. And certainly games are incredible storytelling engines, right? Both board games and digital games and other forms of games can really be used effectively to communicate a particular message. Because they allow you to get into the body of the protagonist. You get to walk a mile in their shoes, and so it is an opportunity to build empathy that you can't necessarily get from other forms of media. So today we're going to look a little bit about how thinking about games, how game developers, when they're trying to think of what is going to be engaging for people, what kind of tools they bring to the table, and how can we maybe apply those things to the rest of the world. So my $10 word for the day is ludonarrative dissonance. If any of you are familiar with Latin at all, you'll know that ludo comes from ludus, which means play. Narrative obviously means storytelling, and dissonance is sort of that disagreement or disconnect that's happening. And so ludonarrative dissonance essentially means when the story that the game is telling doesn't match up with the mechanisms being used to tell that story. So, for example, how many of you have played the classic game Battleship, the board game? Okay, a few people. So that's the one here on the left. So in that game, you are basically commanding a fleet of ships, and you have yours hidden behind one screen, and the opponent has theirs hidden behind another screen, and you're just trying to find them. And it really simulates, what it was like in World War II, when these fleets would be trying to hunt each other out in the Pacific. And how many of you have played Monopoly? Pretty much everybody. Okay. So Monopoly is a real estate game. You're buying up properties. You're getting to play with money and things like that. And it's a really, a lot of people find it to be a fun game. I don't personally, but but they each have very clear mechanisms that sort of fit with the story that they're trying to tell. So now imagine for a second that you took the themes of these games and swapped them out, right? And so now the World War II battleship game is suddenly, you're using money and buying up property, and in the real estate game, you're, hiding behind screens trying to hit different targets. It wouldn't really make a lot of sense, would it? It would really seem rather bizarre. And so a lot of ways we do the same sort of things in our own lives and in our society. There's this narrative disconnect between the stories that we tell and the things that we say that we value and what we actually end up doing and the experiences that we actually end up having. For example, I have a whole bunch of tote bags at home because I care about the environment, right? And so I go to the supermarket, I go down the different aisles, I go to the produce section because I like to eat healthy. I grab, 30 different items, something like that, stick it all in my basket, walk up to the register, and then, I left the bags at home, right? And so I walk out of there with a bunch of plastic or paper bags instead of using my wonderful tote bags. And so right there's a disconnect between what I say is important to me and what I actually end up doing in the real world. And we see that, on a society-wide level as well. We say that we care about one thing, but when it actually comes down to it, we really don't put our effort towards those things. So there's a researcher in behavioral economics named Dan Ariely, and he was giving a talk a number of years ago, and he was saying, he talks a lot about, these motivations and nudging people in the direction of doing different things. And he said, if you had to invent an issue that was intended to demotivate people, you'd come up with global warming. Because think about it for a moment. It's something that you can't see, it's going to happen off somewhere in the future, and it's mostly going to affect somebody else. And I would also add on to that as well, that it's, that because it's something that we see as happening sometime in the future, we secretly hope that there's going to be some new technology that's going to come along, that's going to solve the problem, and we won't have to make any of the tough decisions or sacrifices needed to solve the problem, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why the whole, this is a global conspiracy of scientists doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because if they were really trying to take over the economic engines of the world, they would come up with a much better story, right? I mean, you're going to care about the monster that's going to kick down your door tonight, not the one that possibly might come 50 years from now, Yeah, and somebody else's door, exactly. So how do we create a sense of motivation around something that doesn't necessarily get people immediately energized? So there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about something called gamification, and the idea is to take game-like elements and apply them to real-world situations. So you sometimes see things like points or leaderboards or adding levels to things. Badges have become pretty common. And these are implemented in all sorts of customer loyalty programs. And you think of something like frequent flyer miles, for example. That's all really kind of using gamification ideas, although it was originally developed before gamification was even a term. So here is gamification expert Yu-Kai Cho presents an alternate idea to gamification, because it's gotten a little bit controversial in the last couple years. And he talks about human-focused design, which is opposed to function-focused design, which is where we usually tend to focus our attention. When we're crafting public policy and we're implementing different systems, we often tend to think about, well, what is it that we want the system to do, and not so much about how do we want people to operate in it, how do we want them to go about accomplishing what it is that we want them to do. So when we look at the world as game designers, we have to stop thinking of human beings as cogs in the machine, carrying out all of our carefully laid plans. People are always going to move and act within systems the way they want to, not the way we want to. By thinking like a game designer, we close that gap as much as possible. So Cho has developed an 8-point engagement scale for products and systems based around 8 core human drives. So you have meaning, accomplishment, empowerment, ownership, social influence, scarcity, unpredictability, and avoidance. And so whenever you're trying to design a system, you want to try to keep these different motivations in mind. And so he uses a term from cowboy movies to illustrate his points, which are black hat and white hat designs. In the old cowboy movies, the good guy typically was wearing the white hat, and the black hat was usually the villain in the story. Black hat techniques are not necessarily bad, and white hat techniques are not necessarily good either. It's just a question of, is it more about something that is potentially going to benefit you versus trying to avoid something that is going to potentially harm you. So for example, an urgent email asking people to call their senators to stop a bill that would strip people of their rights would be a black hat technique, but obviously is something that is intended to have good outcomes, right? On the other hand, many totalitarian dictatorships appeal to people's desire for meaning, accomplishment, and empowerment. Those would all be white hat techniques, but obviously implemented with very dire consequences. So those different terms don't necessarily indicate whether it might have good or bad outcomes. So one of the first things that a game designer needs to appreciate is that people are lazy. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, we evolved to conserve energy. If we weren't lazy to some degree, we wouldn't be here because, our ancestors would have long since, starved to death or gotten eaten by an animal. So the ability to conserve energy is an extremely important thing, but it does mean that we sometimes need to have things made much simpler for us or to, streamlined in some way. To use another example, from Whole Foods, when you go up to the trash at Whole Foods after you've, eaten something at the cafeteria, you've got about 2 seconds of looking at that signage to figure out which receptacle you're supposed to be dumping it in before you just throw it in the trash and call it a day. So there are different ways we can sort of give people the information they need and present it in a kind of an intuitive way. During the oil embargo of the 1970s, there was a housing complex near Amsterdam, and they noticed that a number of houses were using 1/3 less energy than the other homes in the complex. The houses were all nearly identical, so what was the cause? And there was no difference in terms of who was living in the houses. The demographics were basically the same in the houses that were using much less energy. But when they went inside, they found that the electric meter for those houses was in the front foyer, and in all the other houses, it was down in the basement. So just being able to get that information as they're walking through the door was enough to make them think about conserving more energy, and they were being more mindful of their electric bills. And so just little things like that can have a dramatic impact. 1/3 less energy being consumed in those homes. And one of the reasons why it's been so difficult cutting greenhouse gas emissions has been because there's so little feedback in our choices. The gases are invisible. You don't really immediately see the effects that it's having on you. You don't see how much you are personally producing necessarily. So one of the solutions that's been proposed to something like this is a cap and trade system, right? So this puts a clear dollar value on emissions and allows companies to trade carbon credits with each other. So companies that produce fewer emissions could sell their credits to companies that, for one reason or another, produce more, right? And in some ways, cap and trade systems are an example of gamification. It identifies a large, vague problem with a lot of ambiguity and puts a structure in place that hits many of the core drives mentioned earlier. It makes use of fear and of loss by placing a dollar cost on continuing pollution. It also balances that by offering the opportunity for empowerment. Companies are not forced into a one-size-fits-all solution. They have room to be autonomous and decide what the best way is to move forward. One of the biggest problems, though, with simple monetary rewards is that generally they don't work as effective motivators. One of the things that we've completely gotten wrong is the idea that intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation stack. So the things that make us feel good and make us want to do good things, and versus the things that are external rewards to us. We kind of thought, well, if you already want to do something, then paying you to do it will make you do it even more. And that's not true at all. The research is very clear about this. Once the extrinsic motivation comes in, it basically wipes out the intrinsic motivation. This is one of the reasons why the idea of paying students for good grades, maybe you've heard about this idea, just handing them money for getting good grades, is such a terrible idea. Paying students for grades won't motivate them by adding financial incentive to the joy of learning. The financial incentive will actually kill the joy of learning. The scientific research is very clear on this. The human brain has not evolved to take in the sum total of motivating factors, no matter how rational we think it would be. But game designers also understand another thing. There's another good reason not to pay students, because sure, they may actually work harder to get good grades, but what is the much more likely thing that they are going to do to get those good grades, to get the money? Cheat, exactly. And game designers know this. They always know that any game they build, there's always going to be people trying to figure out some way to cheat the system, to make the game, work for them. But interestingly, there are some ways to use money as a motivator, and that's to simply tantalize people with the possibility of money. In one study, researchers found that paying people to stay in a drug treatment program had a dismal effect on their participation rates. On the other hand, when they offered a raffle for anyone who completed the program, retention rates rose dramatically. It wasn't even a lot of money that they stood to win. It was like $100 or something like that. It was just the possibility of winning that enticed them. In 2010, Sweden rolled out a system that took advantage of the appeal of a possible reward. Traffic cameras would record license plates of people driving at or under the speed limit and automatically enroll them in a lottery if they were driving below the speed limit or below the speed limit. And the money for these payouts would come from the fines imposed on the people who were speeding. Of course, in the United States, fines are also an important revenue-generating mechanism for the government at all levels, and this creates a clear incentive for governments to find new things to fine people for and seek out people they can be confident will be unable to resist those fines. One of the reasons why the United States in particular struggles with police brutality against minorities is the fact that minorities are so heavily policed. A big reason for that is the excessive policing a big reason for that excessive policing is to generate money for municipal governments through fining. If the money for fines were instead put into these kinds of lottery systems intended to reward law-abiding citizens rather than fill government coffers, the incentive to over-police would be diminished. Fines could once again be a way to genuinely deter bad behavior rather than a way to nickel and dime the public without raising taxes. In another story from the Netherlands, since 1989, they have run something called the Postcode Lottery, which raises money for charity. A drawing is held in which everybody in a given postal code who buys a lottery ticket wins a prize of around $12,500. But you only win if you actually bought a ticket. But the interesting part was that researchers found that people participated in this lottery vastly more than they participated in other lotteries being run in the country, even though the jackpot was significantly lower than it would have been for these other lotteries. And so they decided to ask people in these areas, why were they buying these lottery tickets? And the main reason they found was anxiety. Why? What were they anxious about? Anybody want to take a guess? Losing out. The thing they were afraid of was that if their particular district was drawn and all of their neighbors bought lottery tickets, every one of them would have won, but they wouldn't have won, right? And you don't get that with a national lottery where everyone's buying and you got your own unique number. But you do get that if all of your neighbors are suddenly potentially going to win something and you won't win it. So now let's take this idea and possibly fix American democracy. So how can we apply this simple mechanism to something around the democratic process? So of course there are a number of different things that we can do to, say, increase voter turnout, right? We can make the election day a national holiday. We can automate voter registration. We can allocate more money for more voting machines and voting locations. And of course not adopting policies intended to cause voter suppression would all be wonderful things. But there's just one problem. Politicians have no incentive to make it easier for people to vote. No politician does. You may think it's a liberal versus a conservative thing, but in reality, every politician is motivated to keep their support base as small as possible because they want to keep the fewest number of people happy while holding on to power. So if we want to force them to adopt policies that could increase voter turnout, we have to find a popular way to solve this. Enter the postcode lottery. In our configuration, instead of postal codes, it would use congressional districts and the District of Columbia. So every district would have a base 1 in 436 chance of winning the district lottery. Everybody in that district who cast a vote would be eligible to win. So why not just hold a contest every election cycle with the prize going to the district with the highest voter turnout? The problem is that the same few wealthy districts will keep winning year after year. They have the greatest means to get to the polls and the most resources devoted to ensuring that there's enough functioning voter equipment. People aren't standing online for hours to vote in wealthy suburban districts. Even worse, it actually incentivizes districts to suppress voter activity in other nearby districts. But we should reward higher voter turnouts. That's why each state should be ranked in terms of voter turnout. The districts in the lowest ranking states will get 1 additional chance to win. The districts in the highest ranking states will get 50 additional chances to win. And why is this important? Because voter suppression happens largely at the state level. Maryland can't do much to suppress the voter turnout in Virginia, right? But in this lottery scheme, wealthy white districts would suddenly be actively hurting themselves by decreasing voter turnout in poor minority neighborhoods. Increasing voter turnout in all districts in the state increases the odds that one district will win the prize over everybody else in the country. And once they have real incentive about increasing voter turnout, they'll start demanding those other things that we talked about, like having a day off for election day and other things like that. And any politician who is against this plan has to actively come out on giving away free money to their constituents, and that's not really a winning proposition. Of course, a plan like this shouldn't be seen as a panacea, but could be one of a number of different strategies that could start to rebuild this country's civic culture. So one of the other problem areas today is about how people get their information. We are living in a highly polarized society, and our social media often makes this worse by creating echo chambers where we only engage with people who already agree with us. In the wake of the election, there were a number of articles chiding us for only seeking information that reinforced our own biases. And I saw a lot of people bragging about how they like to consume news media from a wide variety of sources. So I started following a bunch of conservative sources that I hadn't previously been following. And after about a week, I was ready to be done with that. Because the tone of many of these articles that I was looking at from supposedly reputable conservative sources were just so awful and unpleasant, and just even if the content in the articles were true, I wouldn't be willing to accept it because of the way it was being presented to me. But I still want to address possible blind spots in my knowledge of the world, right? Getting a wide variety of opinions shouldn't feel like an out-of-control endurance test. Getting news from the other side should not be a nightmare. The problem is that information outlets have a strong incentive to cater to a particular audience, right? There's that word again, incentive, the ways we build these systems to encourage people to go this way instead of that way. If we want to change the way they present their content, we have to change how they're interacting with their audiences. So imagine if there were a news site with conservative writers and liberal writers who were specifically tasked with writing content for the other side. The liberal writers wouldn't write articles for liberals, and it would be the conservatives would write articles for liberals, and liberals would write articles for conservatives. And it might seem like a website that would be catering to the snowflakes in each of us, articles carefully purged of any sort of snark or insults that might offend the other side, and maybe it is. But it's also very clear right now that we are highly avoidant of content that doesn't confirm our existing views. Anything that helps break the echo chambers would be an improvement at this point. Also in the area of journalism, local newspapers are the lifeblood of a healthy democracy. In addition to being crucial for feeding news stories to national news outlets, they also shed light on the activities of local political forces. When local journalism dies, local corruption runs rampant. And yet we're seeing local newspapers folding all over the country. CNN, Huffington Post, and Politico are never going to cover city council meetings. They aren't going to cover criminal proceedings where the case doesn't have national importance. People posting on social media may be reporting on the local issues, but they're also not obliged to report information accurately. No one is going to hold them accountable for misrepresenting the facts. You need good local journalism for those things. But aside from the fact that many people don't want to pay for subscriptions to local news services, they also have no habit built around reading news from their communities. They have no idea who their municipal, county, or even state representatives are. At least I know that's true for people in my generation. They know more about the policy debates going on in Congress than they do about the ones going on in their own towns. So how could we change that? So I think a useful example that we can potentially draw upon is last year's smash hit mobile game, Pokemon Go. So in this game, people were going out into the world with their mobile phones, and they were able to catch little digital monsters on their phone at real-world locations. So this creature might appear, down the street somewhere, and you'd have to actually walk down the street in order to go catch it. And now they've introduced things where you can participate in these things called raids, where you go to a specific location and at a particular time, and dozens of other people all show up in the same spot, and you work together to try to defeat this monster usually and catch it. And it's been immensely engaging. It's not nearly as popular now as it was last year. Last year you couldn't walk around on the streets without seeing people playing it. But it's still an interesting way that we could potentially generate interest in these types of things. So imagine standing at a bus stop, and you open up your mobile app that is populated with news stories from the last year or two related to the area you're currently in. Maybe there was a major fire around the block 6 months ago, or maybe there was an uproar for a new traffic light 2 streets over last year, right? And so you would suddenly be able to see what's going on just by looking at this app, what's going on in the neighborhood where you're in, and you can click on those articles and read through those. You could earn points and unlock badges from finishing articles and answering quizzes about the things that they've read. Tie it into social media, and people will be able to share the interesting news stories they come across with their friends and hopefully get more people participating. Of course, it would never achieve the kind of popularity that something like Pokemon Go had, but it would at least put more knowledge of local issues out into the community. It would also not be terribly challenging to create apps that would let people put in their zip code and immediately get detailed information on every elected official representing them from the local to the national level. There are already some apps that will provide this information that show you not only your representatives on the congressional level, but also what bills are going to be coming up soon, and you can vote on them and offer your feedback on those. Countable is a very popular app for doing that, but it doesn't quite tie in all of those different levels. It doesn't provide local and state information. In a system like this, users may be able to easily send off emails to their lawmakers on the issues they care about from the app, and they can post to their social media accounts to get their friends involved. It's easy and intuitive, which, as we said before, is something crucial for getting people engaged with something, that you have to really set the bar low in order to get them involved. So I would like to see something like that operating at absolutely every level of government. But it's also important that I talk at least a little bit about the way these types of gamification systems can be abused. Of course, if we can motivate people in a meaningful behavior to do something they want to do, then we can potentially push them into behavior they don't want to do. Has anybody here ever seen the TV show Black Mirror? Nope? Okay. It's a Netflix show. It's absolutely fantastic. If you were ever a fan of The Twilight Zone, check out Black Mirror. It's basically one-off episodes telling a different story, and usually there's a lot of philosophical ideas or sort of social concerns, warnings in there. But possibly the scariest one is also the most realistic one, which was called Nosedive. It takes place in the very near future, where everyone participates into a single star-based online reputation system. As soon as you interact with a person, you can see what their reputation is, and you can vote them up or down depending on how rewarding your interaction was with them. So, you go get your coffee in the morning, and the barista's nice to you. Well, I'm going to vote that person up, Or they were rude to you. Well, now I'm going to vote that person down. And worse yet, the value of your vote is dependent on how high your ranking is already. So if you're a low-ranked person, then if you vote on somebody, then it doesn't quite have as much of effect as if a high-ranking person downgrades you, then that's really bad. So the main character in that story, she's really eager to get her ranking up, and her friend who has a really high rank is getting married, and there's going to be a wedding, and she says, oh, this is great, I'm going to go to this wedding, and I'm going to be able to schmooze with all these really important people, and then I'm going to walk out of there, and I'm going to be a superstar, right? And then as she's walking out her door to get into the cab to go to the airport, she bumps into a jogger, and that jogger downgrades her. And then, her flight got canceled, so now she needs another flight. Oh, but her ranking is now just too low to get the good seat on the flight, and so she ends up getting mad at the person at the counter, and then she gets downgraded again, and then all the people in line downgrade her, and it's just this downward spiral. And the reality is we're kind of close to that point. We're kind of getting nearer and nearer to that idea. And in fact, China is currently rolling out something that is terrifyingly similar to that, which is called Sesame Credit. And basically, what it is it scores it scores citizens based on how loyal they are to the government. All right? So if they post positive articles about the government on social media, or they post positive articles about the state of the economy on social media, their ranking goes up. If they post negative articles, their ranking goes down. And what's worse is that if you are friends with somebody who has a low ranking, your ranking goes down. So it actively encourages the citizenry to distance themselves from people who are not supportive of the government, or are not as supportive of the government as the government thinks they should be. And right now it's voluntary, but in 2020 it's going to be mandatory for every Chinese citizen to be participating in this, and it's going to affect things like getting loans. It's going to affect their ability to get government paperwork, which of course in China there's a lot of red tape for things, so that can seriously hinder their ability to just basically function in life. So we have to be careful with these systems of motivation. As I said before, we can use these techniques for incredible good or evil. When we're building systems that encourage and support people doing the things that they already want to do but don't do for whatever reason, then it's beneficial. If the system pressures people to do things they don't want to do and to act against their own interests, then it's manipulative. So let's bring this around to education. If we want our children to be the builders of tomorrow, we're going to have to teach them how to work with people and how to understand how people think and interact with the world. We can sit around and think up great ideas to make the world a better place, but if we don't create plans that actively engage people's motivations, we're just spinning our wheels endlessly without making progress. Moral behavior isn't just about knowing the right thing to do. It's about being motivated to do the right thing. Game developers have a better understanding of human behavior than perhaps anybody else in the world. We should encourage our children not only to play games that present them with moral dilemmas and challenge their ethical thinking, but we should also teach them to crack these games open and look at the underlying mechanisms that shape the behavior of the players. It's only through looking at the world through that lens that we can create a world that we actually want to live in. Thank you.